of things before we get to the passage. One, yesterday afternoon I talked about Darby and Newton, not John. You know, whenever we hear about Newton in church history, we think about John. This was so. It may not have occurred to you, but if it did, it was B.W. Newton. And secondly, I got a story about Pastor Davies I want to tell you. And Pastor, this is a good story. Got nothing to fear. You come out very well in the story. Many years ago, I was having a conversation with Dr. Key Ying, pastor at Evangel. And I used to go there from time to time, preach and things. And Dr. Ying is quite a renowned doctor, acupuncturist, and, you know, people have gone to him from all over the country. And Dr. Ying told me about, you know, people's health generally and how we all have different kinds of constitutions. You know, some struggle a little bit more with colds and flus and other things, and we're all sort of different, made differently. And he said, you know, people, we're like cars, some models more reliable than others. And then he turned to me and he said, Nigel Davies, he's a Rolls Royce. So, Pastor, if you ever need any reinforcement, positive reinforcement, you are a Rolls Royce. You don't need one, you are one. Did I ever share that with you previously? Yeah, something I probably should have mentioned to you many years ago, but anyway. This morning, I want us to look at John 13. Interesting, we've been in John this morning already with Pastor Ross, and it's been exciting to see how our messages have dovetailed and complemented one another. John 13 is, of course, a well-known passage dealing with the foot washing of Christ, of his disciples. And trust God would help us see Jesus in his sacrificial service. At the cross, he is the suffering servant. Here, he is the sacrificial servant. And if we don't see the Lord as the servant who then went to the cross, then we don't see him the way the Bible portrays him. This incident in John 13 is the greatest example of servanthood apart from the cross itself. Apart from the cross itself. This is where the Lord shines brightly as servant of his people. If you have, as you have read through the Gospels, you'll come to realize that the Gospels are an uneven treatment of the life of Christ. All of them focus on his 3-year public ministry. But even within those 3 years, there is still an even more uneven treatment. The Gospels have 89 chapters in our Bibles. And of those 89 chapters, 29 of those chapters, some 35% cover 1 week in the life of Christ. Luke, 27% of his Gospel is that week leading up to the crucifixion. Matthew, 35%. Mark, 38%. John, 40%. 40%. As one of my teachers said, the Gospels are no ordinary biography because Jesus did not live an ordinary life. Another writer said that each Gospel is actually a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Well, those chapters are just building to the week. And when you think about the fact that the Old Testament covers sort of 4,000 years, and then the New Testament just 100 years, and then you have the Gospels that cover just 1 week. No wonder John records Jesus' words about the hour coming, because in comparison to history of the world, this is a comparative hour. Key time in redemption history. And this event in John 13 takes place the night before the cross itself. And I think in John 13, it's going to help us do 2 things today. 2 things. Number one, it will help us to understand how to be a servant. And secondly, it ought to increase our desire to be true servants of the Lord. Now, I want you to know that disciples themselves deeply struggle with this idea of servanthood. This is something that they fought over, they debated. This is something they never found resolution to among themselves. Earlier in Mark chapter 9, in Capernaum, they had been inside a house, and the Lord asked them, he knew what they'd been speaking of. He said, "What was it that you disputed among yourselves?" And of course, they were too embarrassed to tell him. They held their peace. There was some blushing going on. Because in verse 34 of Mark 9, they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. Who should be the greatest? I mean, what an arrogant conversation, that having been with the Lord and having had him serve them and love them, even before this foot washing incident, that they're not getting with the Lord's agenda. They've not figured that out. I was talking to a Christian school teacher just a week or two ago, and the teacher was saying how, she just likes being a school teacher, having a class, because you go any higher up and there's politics. There's politics. And I said, there was a bit of politicking among the 12. Even they had some of it. It's hard to get away from that. And of course, in Mark 9, Jesus sits them down and he says to them, if a man desire to be first, he ought to be the last of all, the servant of all. And he takes a child, sets them in the midst, and he takes them up in his arms and talks about receiving a child in his name. And even Christians, even God's people, really struggle with this idea of servanthood and putting others first. And we take this into the Christian life. In the secular world, in the workforce, every sphere of working and production and things, you have a certain trajectory you can kind of go on. And basically we need to have that. It's actually part of the Dominion mandate. Because with a whole bunch of workers and labourers, you need someone to look after them, and you need someone over him or her, and you need business owners. You need someone to run hospitals. You need junior doctors. You need more senior doctors who have some expertise. You need those who do the research. We actually need leadership. We actually need a pecking order. This helps us even in a fallen world. And of course, in the kingdom of God, as we serve Christ, it is somehow different. Because although you still need, for want of a better term, a pecking order and some organisation and some leadership, things like that, the trajectory of serving Christ, in one sense, goes the other way. It doesn't really go up, it kind of goes down, because as we know the Lord year by year and serve him, we're meant to be greater servants of him. Not so much that we even would do more, but it's the way we do things for him. It's the way we serve others. And this was a titanic struggle among the disciples. Probably something, certainly, they were still grappling with even after the ascension and after they received God's Holy Spirit. Now have a look at verse 1 through to 3 of John 13. It says, now before the feast of the Passover, and notice John's commentary. Notice his commentary. We get these additional observations that John gives years later. When Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil, having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he was come from God and went to God, and then he launches into this foot washing incident. John makes three statements in the beginning of this chapter. Three statements that help us understand the heart of Jesus the servant. Very important. The first statement John makes is that Jesus knew his hour had come. Jesus is in the will of his Father. I mean, right back from John 2, miracle at Cana. Woman, what have I to do with him? Mine hour is not yet come. And he's sort of putting people off, and finally the hour has come. Jesus, he's in the center of God's will for his life. And then verse 1 tells us that he loved his own that were in the world. He loved them to the end. Jesus is not only in the will of God, he is committed in his love toward his followers. He's absolutely devoted in love to them, and he loves them so much, he will go to that cross. He will endure the shame that Hebrews 12 talks about. So you know his hour has come. He is committed in love toward his followers. And thirdly, look at verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, even despite the betrayal of Judas, and that he was come from God and went to God. And even in that very brief expression that he was come from God, you know what that is? Pre-existence of Christ. Right there. In just a little phrase. He came from God. He didn't come from Mary in that sense. He came from the Father in eternity past. He came from God and he went to God. This is John's spiritual narrative alongside the facts of the events leading to the crucifixion. So here's the point. Just as Jesus is on the verge of washing his disciples' feet, he has one of the 12 betray him. I mean, what a blow. Jesus' act of servanthood did not occur in favorable circumstances. It didn't occur in favorable circumstances. And our acts of servanthood will occur in a sin-cursed world, chaos reigning from time to time. All of our service is carried out in an imperfect ministry setting, in an imperfect workplace, even in an imperfect home. That's where God has called us to serve him. And so the grass is never greener. Well, maybe for a few months. But Christ's act of service coming up was given in circumstances of real opposition. Real opposition. Now, let's go back briefly to those three statements, because guess what? You and I cannot live as God's servants in this world if, like Jesus was, we're not following God's will. If we're living our own kind of life, if we're living life according to our own terms, we'll miss servanthood entirely. I mean, this is just a first order issue. Are we sensitive to the will of God in our life? Christ was. He was led of the Spirit. He was fulfilling the Father's will right throughout. And so the first question is, are we doing God's will as best as we know? And I ask that to all of us here, without exception. Without exception. Are we, like Jesus, lovingly committed to God's people? Are we lovingly committed to God's people? And what I mean by that is, are we willing to love others when they don't love us? That's commitment. That's commitment. Do we love others when they do not love us? And thirdly, do we believe, as Jesus did, that the Father had given all things into his hands? Do we believe God is in control? I mean, that helps an awful lot. When you're trying to serve the Lord and others and things aren't going according to plan and all these other difficulties, well, if God is in control, that takes a lot of pressure off. Takes an awful lot of pressure off the situation. Just one other note. To be a servant is not the same as to be servile. To be a servant is not the same as being servile. Because Christ, in serving his disciples, still led them. He still rebuked them. He still organized them. He still was the Lord and Master. And so don't confuse being a servant with being servile. But that's another message. It's another message. But I thought I'd just a mental note about that. And so as Christ is in the center of God's will, as he is committed in love, as he knows his Father really is in control, we move into this example of sacrificial service. It says in verse 4, he riseth from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. After that he poureth water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. And you're well aware of the practice in Bible times of people even wearing sandals. They would get dirty during the day on those dusty roads and fields, and would need their feet to be washed by the lowest servant. I mean, even we live in a pampered generation. We have shoes and socks, and you know, a day in shoes and clean socks, it's not very pleasant, is it? How much more living in that day and age. And so the Lord takes the lowliest task of the lowliest servant. And of course, Peter isn't following what the Lord is doing. Peter is deeply disturbed by this. Do you know, in Luke's parallel account, the same argument breaks out that we saw in Mark chapter 9. We won't turn there, but in Luke's gospel it says that, behold, the hand of him that betrayeth me is with me at the table, and truly the Son of Man goeth as it was determined, but woe unto that man by whom he is betrayed. And they began to inquire among themselves which of them it was that should do this thing. And there was also a strife among them which of them should be accounted the greatest. So this argument breaks out the night before Calvary, and they're still fighting about who's going to be way up the batting order, so to speak. Just the night before. These are the men that are supposed to carry the gospel to the world. After 3 years with the Lord, they didn't get it. And natural man does not understand true biblical servanthood. Even the redeemed ones, it takes some time for the penny to drop. Servanthood that is God and others focused. And I think servanthood is hard because humility is hard. Pastor Alan Mitchell, a friend of mine, he said something to me once that was worth writing down. Yeah, I have a few quotes, but he said, and it stuck with me. He said, "This is how you know when you're a servant. This is how you know when you're a servant. By how you respond when people treat you like one. When you get treated like nothing, you will immediately learn if you are, and if you know you are." Jesus, in this act of washing their feet, was teaching them something profound that they would never get. They would never get from the first Adam. That he would lead them in a way that would be in their interests. They benefited from this act of service. They did. He didn't. There was nothing in it for Jesus. Nothing in it for him. This doesn't further his agenda. And that the Lord would lead them in such a way that was always for their spiritual good. And that's biblical leadership today. Whether it's in a classroom or in a church or in any kind of ministry, we lead to God's glory. We lead in such a way that we bring people spiritual benefit and grace. And we don't lead in such a way that it would further our own ambitions. We let God take care of that. He looks after all of those things. Let me make a few more points from this passage. Secondly, I want you to know the first point we looked at this morning was that biblical servanthood is hard to grasp. Second point is that biblical servanthood follows authentic cleansing. Look at 8 down to verse 11. Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. Simon Peter saith unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my feet. Jesus saith to him, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him, therefore he said, Ye are not all clean. Peter, though the closest to the Lord in the sense that he was first of the 12, seemed to have no inhibitions in clashing with Christ. He had no inhibitions in trying to correct Christ, in trying to challenge Christ. Lord, you won't go to the cross. You're not doing that. And Lord, you won't wash me. And so the Lord, again, he rebukes Peter, and he says, Peter, look, if I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. And then Peter's no becomes a very fast yes. I mean, if he's going to do a 180, immediately, that's fine by him. That's fine by him. Man, what a character. A hardhead. Utterly perplexing. And yet the Lord knew that he could work with this fellow, and he'd become very valuable in the kingdom. And so Jesus teaches the truth that there is a difference between absolute cleansing and regular cleansing. There is a cleansing that comes from knowing Christ, having a part in Christ, and then there is a regular cleansing that we need each day out there in the world, just like getting dirty feet every day. Believers are forgiven, but need to be forgiven. Believers are clean. They're clean. But they need cleansing. The Bible teaches both those truths. We saw Saturday morning in 1 Corinthians 6 where Paul talks about the different sins in the life of the Corinthians, and he says, but you were washed. God washed you. But then in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus tells his followers to pray that God would forgive us our debts as we'd forgive others. In 2 Corinthians 7, we are to cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Of course, 1 John 1, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. And the point is that people that go around today saying that believers don't need to confess their sin are in defiance of unambiguous Scripture. I mean, it's not even marginal. It's not even really worth arguing about with them. It is a humility issue. We're forgiven, but we need to be and receive forgiveness every day. Every day. When we moved into our home in Melton, when you buy a home and you see the glossy pictures on the website, the floors are clean, the blinds have been cleaned up, and of course we move into our home and it's filthy. And we have a lot of tile around our house, which makes winter that bit cooler. And we had a commercial floor cleaner operated by my father-in-law, a professional cleaner, willing to serve. And we got that floor spick and span. We had it sparkling. The problem is we have 3 sons. And isn't it amazing? You can bring a floor. You can almost revive tiles. You can revive them. And yet you're cleaning those things 3, 4, 5 times a day. To the point where kids, you want some crumbly food and muffins outside. Outside. Clean but needing cleansing. And notice the warning in verse 11. For he knew who should betray him, therefore he said, Ye are not all clean. The warning. Physical association with Jesus is not enough. Family association with Jesus is not enough. You've heard that God has children, he has no grandchildren. He doesn't do grandchildren. He just does children by faith in him. Cultural association with Christ is not enough. You can come from a Christian country, so to speak, and that's not enough. J.C. Ryle said that privileges alone without grace save nobody and will only make hell deeper. Let us never be surprised if we see hypocrisy and false profession among Christians in modern days. There's nothing new in it, nothing peculiar, nothing that did not happen even among Christ's own immediate followers and under Christ's own eyes. Bad money, Ryle says, bad money is a strong proof that there is good coin somewhere. Christianity has always had some bad eggs. It's always had some really, really bad eggs. And if there is any consolation that the Lord got one bad egg of 12, it means that the rest of us can't complain when we see some bad eggs around the place. Because it's always been the case. There was a noted British pastor and preacher in the late 1980s. He was successor to none less than John Stott in the university evangelism. This was a huge movement in Britain. This fellow had a large church. He was an evangelical leader. He wrote Bible commentaries. He spoke at the most prominent conferences. And in the late 1990s, he announced he was leaving the ministry and he was leaving his wife for another man, this particular fellow. In fact, he wrote articles defending same-sex relationships in an evangelical setting. As I understand the New Testament, you cannot embrace that kind of lifestyle and still have Jesus Christ. You can't celebrate that lifestyle and enjoy regeneration of the Spirit of God. Christianity has always had the bad eggs, and sometimes they began looking like good eggs. The next point is that biblical servanthood is modeled by Jesus himself. Look at verse 12 through to verse 16. So after he had washed their feet and had taken his garments and was set down again, he said unto them, Know ye what I have done to you? Ye call me Master and Lord, and ye say, Well, for so I am. If then your Lord and Master have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that sent greater than he that sent him. Now, Jesus noted that they recognized he was Lord and Master. That's not in dispute. For them, it was who's going to be number two. The Lord's one, but I'm going to be two. You've got to be 3, 4, and 5, and on it went. So they recognized that, and he said, you have done well. You've done well. You get that much. And then he says, reasoning in verse 14, look, if I'm the Lord and Master, which I am, and I've washed your feet, then you can do the same with each other. If the greater can serve the lesser, the least can serve each other. Equals can serve each other. If it's going to go down vertically, the service, it can go across horizontally. But then he again repeats the commandment, verse 15. He reinforces it. For I've given you an example. I mean, the Lord is underlining what he just did. He is emphasizing it again. He could have stopped at verse 14. If I'm your Lord and Master, you ought to wash one another's feet. Full stop. Move on, but he stays there and he parks there and he keeps on going back to being servants. I gave you this example. We need an example. We work better when we have examples, do we not? We need to see things being done. People learn when they can see things, when they can hold things and touch things, not just hear things. And that's why Jesus said in John 17 that for their sakes he sanctified himself. He sanctified himself for our benefit and our sakes. But then he reinforces again in verse 16, verily, verily, truly, truly. I mean, he cannot emphasize this point enough. I say unto you, The servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. An allusion to the willingness of the Son to follow the leading of the Father in coming into the world, and we serve under the Son. Why does the Lord have to reinforce this? Because the disciples had missed it. And I got to tell you, we miss it. I miss it. I miss it more than I would like to admit. We don't like being treated as servants. We don't like it when people treat us as servants. We think we deserve more honor, more glory, more respect. And when we don't get it, it stuns us. It surprises us. How few people saw us do this? How few people thanked us for doing that? How few people appreciated us doing all of these things? And it is nothing more than sort of sanctified selfishness, really. We have not yet learned, I've not yet learned the lessons of servanthood. And I tell you what's even more dangerous is when we think we have understood servanthood, when we think we have got there, and we think we have worked this out. We don't tend to learn servanthood the first time, but usually after many times and after we've seen it modeled, slowly the truth kicks in. Was this expected in the early church? Remember in 1 Timothy 5 when the church had a glut of widows who needed the support of the church. And Paul gives this list of requirements for widows. They got to be at least 60 years old, and their previous marital life had to be in order, and they were well reported of, and they brought up children. And if she's lodged the stranger's feet, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she's relieved the afflicted, if she's diligently followed every good work, you can help them. They're going to get the support of the church. And so this sacrificial service was expected in the church. It wasn't just sort of neatly forgotten and ignored. Next point. Biblical servanthood brings lasting happiness. Brings lasting happiness. Look at verse 17. If ye know these things, happy are ye if ye do them. You know, sometimes the cause of spiritual emptiness is that we have not learned sacrificial service. The paradox is the more you serve God and others, the more God has a way of blessing you and meeting you and revealing himself to you. True joy, paradoxically, comes from death to self and sacrificial service. A life full of self is empty of Christ. The answer is never in ourselves. I read a story of a lady, wasn't in this country, I forget if it was in Europe or somewhere, who married herself at a ceremony. She married herself. She just found someone good enough for her. You know, she had to search long and hard and realized the answer was just right there inside. She married herself. Now, you know, to celebrate that kind of narcissism, that flagrant, overt pride. And I'm convinced this is, you know, we're going to get more of this kind of bizarre stuff, and to the world, this is wonderful. This is just people opening up vistas of possibility, and didn't realize all the good that was there, and didn't realize all the fulfillment they could find sitting on the lounge by themselves, meeting their own needs. This is a real winning formula for despair. The answer is never found in ourselves. I mean, you think about Robin Williams, a tremendous comedian in many ways. Not a man who knew the Lord, and not all of his humor and things were that great, but he had a role to play, and left his mark on the world, and he takes his life. You know, George Whitefield, by comparison, the great revivalist, in a shorter biography on him, one woman said that his joy tempted her to become a Christian. Just his general cheeriness. The fellow that lived off, you know, whatever bread and cheese he could get on the road, and very simple means, and he tempted someone to get saved with the kind of joy he had. We live in a part of Melbourne where people are flocking to the western suburbs by the hundreds virtually every week because to them they can afford to buy a home that must be full of happiness. There's this new estate we drive to from time to time, and the developer's very clever because they built these amazing playgrounds. I mean, some of these playgrounds, they could charge a few dollars to get into. And when one of these playgrounds opened up, Katie and I took out all our boys, and in this public playground, it was literally standing room only at a public playground. And we met someone that worked in local council and got to talk to her because we rent off the council, and girl was with her family, and she kept on talking about how they're going to build their dream home right here. She kept talking about the dream home and the dream home this and the dream home that. And all I know to say is this, is that if all of these hundreds of people move out to the western suburbs, if they find happiness in their homes, they'll be the first people that ever did. They'll be the first people in human history that found completeness and joy in bricks and mortar. I mean, how do we have a happy church? How do we have a happy home, for want of a better term? How do we have a joyful, satisfied home and church and family? Well, it comes down to how much we're willing to serve. That's going to be the measure. That's where the measure of joy is, the measure of what we are willing to give to serve God and others. I still remember my pastors in Sydney would pack up chairs Sunday night after, you know, young adults fellowship, and that always, you know, wow, these guys, Pastor Matthews, Pastor Wenham, they're packing up. They do that too. they do what they do, and they move chairs at, you know, 10 o'clock Sunday night. That's wow. That's the real thing. That's the real deal. You know, we cannot die on a cross as Jesus did. We can't do that. But we can wash one another's feet as Jesus did. We can do that. And of course, foot washing is not ritualistic. Because I tell you what, you know, I'm still waiting to have my feet washed. I'm not even my dear wife who'd do anything for me. She has, and I've not washed hers either, to be honest. Let's confession time. Right? I mean, this hasn't happened to me yet. I've not had that kind of servanthood displayed, and I realise there's a context to that, but I've sure had other help. Sure had a lot of other help. It's practical. It's going to depend on where you are, your setting. It's going to be inconvenient. It's going to be inconvenient, this kind of life. And it's not going to happen by accident. You can't just sort of fall over and, what do you know, I wash someone's feet. Pick someone up from the airport. It doesn't happen by accident. And you need to be on the lookout. And it's the antidote to selfishness, and it's a declaration of war against passivity. It's all those things. Let me finish just sharing about our church there in Melbourne, in Open Door. We have been there a little over 5 years. Got there in July 2013. And about a year before that, church had asked us to consider the church. And so we agreed that we would speak at their family camp, September 2012. And so they usually went to the Crystal Creek camp. There was a mix-up with bookings of things. So we were going to have a weekend camp at the church where they met. And at the time, they were meeting in a scout hall. Pastor Mitchell's been there. And we arrived at the Scout Hall, and we went through those doors of the Scout Hall, and I could not believe my eyes. I could not believe my eyes at the state of this Scout Hall. I mean, it was a shed. It was a shed. And let me try and explain what it was like. It was, sort of very, very dark panelled wood and bricks and things. And behind where you preached, there must have been plaques, wooden plaques that had the shape of werewolves. And I think to the side there was a picture of Her Majesty the Queen, and up on behind the wall there was an Australian flag encased in a glass case, and the flag had drooped like that. And this is church. This is church. And we had had a good weekend, and I'm trying to get my head around this building, and how do we get people to come? How do we get new people to come? They had lost families. There were families who said, look, we cannot abide the filth of this place. I mean, they're having parties there Saturday night. Even after you cleaned it, it's dirty. This was where things were at. And this was a real stumbling block for me. I mean, is this place worth coming to? Because I just can't see us. And it got to a point where later on I said to the church, listen, I know pastors in India who have nicer meeting rooms than where we are. This is a real problem. But it was interesting because when we were there for that weekend and then came back the following April, despite the surroundings, there was a small core of people that were servants, that were serving. Rain, hail or shine, pastor or no pastor, they're doing ministry, right? They're going to keep running things and keep reaching out, keep doing things, because to me there was no earthly reason why the church still was operating. And even as we talked about coming down, I got out Pastor Google, and I looked at all the different churches, independent Baptist churches and others, and I said to them, but look, this church is only 10 minutes away. This is only 15 minutes away. This is only 20 minutes away. Are you sure you're going to keep operating? Because I don't want to come from Cairns and, you close up shop in a year's time. And no. We want a church here in Melton for God's glory. No, we want to keep doing this. And so we candidated in April of 2013, there for 3 Sundays. And Kate and I were very busy looking for a house as well. We didn't get a chance to really talk about things. I just wanted her to observe and see and get her perspective. And as we got home, I was positive. And I said to my dear wife, I said, well, what do you think? And she said, how can we not go? How can we not do this? There's a bunch of people that want to serve Christ and they want someone to come and help them and shepherd them. How can we not go? And that was a wonderful assurance to know that we were one on that. She's too good a woman. She would have come anyway. She would have come if I felt that this was right. But I wasn't going to go without her heart in it, because she's just as in this as I am. And I'm thankful that many of those who began with us are still there, still serving. We've got some new people there serving. They're getting a sense of what this church is about. That we're trying to stand against the rampant consumerism of church today, where people want to receive. We were in Cairns a few months ago at some funerals. Some people in the church that we're at in Cairns for 7 years had passed away. One lady we knew, Bet, she was in her late 80s. She went to be the Lord, but the day before Bet passed away, fellow Brett Katana, well-known motorcycle mechanic, his wife Lorraine killed on the road from, I think, coming from Bowen up. And so it's a very large funeral at a particular church that would fit so many of the bikers in Cairns and things like that. And Brett had a wonderful testimony amongst all the bikers. This is a fellow who came to church every Wednesday and to pray for his friends, and they're all at the funeral. But my old pastor told me that when he went to this very large church in Cairns to plan for the funeral, he got out to the foyer, and there are all these sort of little sort of show bag, little gift bags there, all these stacked up. And he asked the pastor, he said, what are all these bags? And the pastor said, oh, it's communion on the go. Yeah. Yeah, I went from horror to, you know, what on earth is this? And please understand that this kind of mentality is becoming the norm, the accepted. Come to a church when you want to come in a way that suits you. And you don't even have to wait with others. You don't even have to tarry with one another anymore. So you can get your little bit of spiritual devotion. John 13 tears that kind of thinking to shreds. May the Lord help us see Jesus in his sacrificial service, and may we be his servants for his glory. Amen. Thank you, Pastor.
Hymn number 368. I've done my best for Jesus. 368.